Ned Block, professor of philosophy and psychology at New York University. Welcome to the podcast.
Oh, thank you.
So, I want to look at both consciousness and artificial intelligence today. And I think the sensible order in which to do that is to look first at broad themes of consciousness within philosophy of mind and cognitive science, and then to jump into a discussion of AI.
Uh-huh.
So, I'll begin by asking
Okay.
you, what is the famous distinction within philosophy of mind between the hard and easy problems of consciousness?
Yeah. Okay. The hard problem is the problem that even if we know the neural basis of a conscious experience, so suppose I'm seeing something red. Suppose we know that the neural basis of that experience is a certain a certain neural state. In fact, we do know something about it. Um, we still That doesn't tell us why that neural state is the basis of that experience as opposed to the basis of a different experience or the basis of no experience at all. We don't have we don't know an explanatory relation between the neural state that is the basis of consciousness and the conscious experience itself. So we do actually have a pretty good idea about at least a substantial chunk of the neural bases of many experiences. So, for example, the experience of motion, of optic flow, is based largely in an area of the visual cortex in the back of the head, an area called MT plus. Um, and we have a lot of evidence. When you see motion, that area activates. When you imagine motion, that area activates. If you stimulate that area, you cause the experience. So we have plenty of evidence of that sort, but nobody really has any idea of why. And also, it's directional, so you can um, uh, see in that area the difference between optic flow in different directions, but nobody knows why it's the base of that experience as opposed to some completely different experience or no experience. So that's the hard problem. The easy problems, these are all David Chalmers' terms.
Mm.
The easy problems, so-called easy problems, are the function of consciousness, how it does what it does. And, those are only easy in a kind of slightly bizarre way. They there's something that's tractable, easy in that sense, tractable.
Mm. So, I mean, as a philosopher, when I first heard this distinction, I'm not
Uh,
understanding what the big deal here is or why Chalmers needed to introduce the distinction in the first place. Because to my mind, like, obviously the hard problem of consciousness needs to be addressed. And as a philosopher, like, that's the more interesting one. So, what's the context here? I mean, before Chalmers, were people not talking about like the main problem of consciousness, how a system can be conscious?
well, the problem itself, I mean, he distinguished between hard and easy
Mm.
problems, but the so-called explanatory gap had been much discussed before that. The gap in an explanation between the neural base of consciousness and consciousness itself. So, yeah. So, but the distinction between hard and easy problems was a useful distinction because it said something. It crystallized the fact that the function of consciousness could be investigated even if we didn't know the answer to the explanatory gap problem. So that was an
Okay.
important thing.
Okay. So, one response to having answered, say, not that we have, but let's say we answer all of the easy problems of consciousness, uncovering
Yeah,
completely the neural basis of consciousness and like how it works within the brain and how changing the
yeah,
brain state, we know exactly what it will do as to a change in the mental state. Many people would look at that as implicitly an answer to the hard problem because they would say, well, now we have a pretty good case for thinking that mental states just are brain states. If they're so
yeah,
intimately connected that they map on one to one in every detail,
yeah.
well, then it
I
would
think
seem
we already have reason to think that mental states are brain states.
okay.
But that doesn't deal with the problem of understanding how it's possible for mental states to be brain states. There's still a
Hmm.
puzzle there, even if mental states are brain states. We understand how water can be H2O, or how lightning can be electrical discharges, um, how heat can be molecular kinetic energy. Those are pretty easy to understand. It's not easy to understand
Mm.
how consciousness could be a brain state. And there's an additional issue, which is, if it turns out that human consciousness is something that we can understand in terms of the brain, what is how do we generalize that to other creatures and to AI?
Mm.
So I call that the harder problem. Uh,
Okay.
so the problem of generalization.
Okay. So this is a bit of a tangent, but as someone with dualist sympathies, I'm curious. Many dualist philosophers will point to the fact that it's very difficult to understand how a brain state could be a mental state. And they'll say, see, that's a good reason for thinking that it's not, for holding to a non-identity here. So I'm curious with you, from someone in your position who acknowledges, okay, this is a real problem. It's very difficult to see how they could be one and the same thing. What are the grounds for thinking that they are the same thing?
Well, the grounds are that we can intervene on brain states and produce conscious states, and in very fine detail. Uh, and When we investigate, we don't see any gap in causation. We don't see any room for a soul or anything like that. I mean, people have speculated that the room for the soul is in quantum mechanical reduction of the wave packet, but not very many people take that seriously now.
Sure.
Um, so there just doesn't seem to be any gap between um, consciousness and the brain, other than the explanatory gap. But and as you say, anyway, that the explanatory gap has been used by Chalmers, earlier by Kripke, and I mean much earlier by Descartes, to argue for dualism.
So within physicalists' understanding of the mind, where
Yeah.
the mental states are or are reducible to physical states of the brain, there's a distinction between reductive and non-reductive physicalism. And this is where I want to begin talking about functionalism. But what's the broad distinction between reductive and non-reductive physicalism?
Well, okay. It's usually understood that uh, uh, the functionalist point of view is one that is non-reductive. It says that if you want to understand consciousness, look to the functional states, the causal relations among them, and those causal relations will tell you the essence of consciousness. That is an inheritor of the behaviorist point of view. And then those functional states will, as people say, be or maybe multiply realizable.
Hmm.
So there's no one physical substrate that is the only substrate that realizes the functional role of consciousness. That's the thought. So you can't reduce it to any one of those things. Consciousness might be, brain state in us, but a silicon state in a robot, some other kind of uh, uh, state in an octopus or an alien. So that non-reductive physicalism is really based on functionalism. It's based on the idea that the real essence of consciousness is something to do with its functional role, and that can be uh, implemented in many different ways.
Okay, so what's a concrete example of a functionalist analysis of a mental state, just to help crystallize the view here?
Well, the old versions were common sense functionalism. Pain causes you to say ouch. Sitting on a tack causes pain. That's a sort of functional role at the level of folk psychology. But the kind of functionalism that most people take seriously now is much more detailed. I called it many years ago psychofunctionalism.
Mm.
But also, with the rise of computational modeling, it's computational functionalism. So people think that the fundamental functional basis is are various kinds of computation.
So when I was taught about functionalism in high school, it was probably this older version where,
That was pretty advanced for high school, boy.
well, I mean, we had a unit of philosophy of mind in the philosophy course.
Uh-huh.
So that's, yeah,
Uh-huh.
we can bring down the expectations of my comprehension. But it was you take behavioral inputs or sensory inputs, and if you correlate them in the right way with certain behavioral outputs, like the sensory inputs of when you put your hand into an open flame, the behavioral output would be pulling it back and saying, ouch. Well, that's a particular function you're executing in that case. And so that just is that functional state that's realized there. That is the mental state of being in pain. What are these more nuanced computational models? Like, what's a functionalism? What's the input? What's the output?
Okay, the function you're talking about sounds like behaviorism.
Mm,
It's purely an input output function.
mm,
The big advance in functionalism over behaviorism was that you had to take into account the causal relations among the mental states involved.
mm.
So the stimulus might cause you to think you have a physical problem, and that might cause you to think maybe I should call the doctor, and that can cause your behavior of calling the doctor. So it's that web of interconnections among the internal states that distinguishes functionalism from behaviorism.
I see. I see. So it seems like at that level, the functionalist analysis of mental states leaves something out that when you're looking at executing a specific function, it seems
Yeah,
conceivable that you could have a non-conscious thing executing functions. I think a lot of people have that intuition. And so that
right.
gets to famous critiques of the functionalist analysis of mental life. I like yours, the Chinese nation thought experiment. So what's that?
Oh, that's the idea that you could have a brain that consists of a lot of people communicating over, the original version from the 1970s was um, they have satellites that and phones and um, uh, uh, communicating among them, and they're doing all the uh, the realization uh, of the functional states. And I started out arguing when I first wrote with the first few drafts of the paper. I started arguing, well, that shows that consciousness can't be a functional state. Then I began to think, well, I don't know. Maybe those information things, maybe all that information flow is what consciousness is. And I then changed my mind, and I think the published version said it was a prima facie objection
Mm.
on the face of it, and that it wasn't dispositive. And I still think that.
And so what
I don't think I don't think it's a conclusive argument by any means.
so the idea is you can simulate a brain neuron by neuron, but instead of neurons, it's people in a big enough collection of people.
Yeah, that's basically it. Yeah.
Okay.
Hmm. And then later, Searle adapted that for the Chinese room, where you have a single person being
Mm.
the CPU of a digital computer.
Okay. Okay. I thought that's funny. I just unconsciously thought that his would have been the first one that inspired the Chinese nation, but that's
Oh
not the
no!
case.
Oh no! No no
No.
no! And he read mine. He told me when he was writing that he'd read mine.
Okay. Okay. Well, that's good to know. We need to keep the
No,
record
it was
straight on that.
just based on it.
Okay.
Searle was not a really good guy as far as acknowledging
Mm,
his sources.
I see.
The guy was more really. I mean, he's still around, but he's in my opinion, is a morally defective person.
Okay. All right. Well, I don't know anything about it, but I'll keep that in mind. So, what are the responses from functionalists to the Chinese nation thought experiment? I mean, I suppose you could bite the bullet, as philosophers say, and just
Yeah,
say this
yeah,
nation is conscious. And
yeah,
interestingly, it includes within its consciousness other conscious subjects. I mean, that by itself
yeah.
seems to be an issue. So, what are the
Yeah.
dominant functionalist responses?
Well, the dominant functionalist responses are, well, okay, the most obvious one is the one you say, just saying, well, if it really did all the right things, it would be conscious. Of course, people say, oh, it's just, it tugs at your intuitions incorrectly because, of course, those people could never act quickly enough to really realize the incredibly difficult functional roles that underlie consciousness. So uh, a lot of people would feel that it's it's what Dennett called an intuition pump that doesn't really show anything. So I think that's the
Mm.
dominant, or that's one major point of view. And I have to say I have some sympathy with that. The idea of a prima facie objection is that you need, it's a burden. It puts the burden on the other side to give some reason for believing functionalism.
Mm. So, something that's always confused me about functionalism is that, and as I've thought about it more, I've realized, well, maybe I'm not understanding it correctly, but you leave out of the account, it seems, like the subjective quality of experience, right? The quality of
Yeah,
what it
that's
is
the
like.
problem. That is the problem. And that's what the Chinese nation thought experiment is supposed to illustrate. You could have all these people phoning each other, and then where's the subjectivity? And I also used another example, which is that the abstract form of the functional state could perhaps be realized in an economy.
Yes. Yes.
So yeah, it just seems like that could happen without any consciousness. And so, I mean, that is that's supposed to be the argument. As I say, I don't think it is a dispositive argument, but that is what it is.
Do functionalists deny that qualia exists? That it is a feature of consciousness?
Okay, so now we get into a definitional thing.
Hmm.
So, people who deny that there is such a thing as consciousness are usually called eliminativists. They say there isn't any such thing. And then other people say, oh, there is such a thing, but it isn't quite what you think it is, something like that. There are some people who think you can a priori analyze consciousness in functional terms. So, it's a typical philosophical issue with many different views.
Okay, so a functionalist could say that that subjective inner quality is not of conscious experience we take ourselves to have is not an illusion. It exists, it's real. But what? But that a functional system just would have that inner
Yeah,
quality? It just would emerge or something?
that's right. That I think is the most common now response,
Okay.
especially given the rise of artificial intelligence, where people are examining whether these AI systems could be conscious, and I think that's the response that most of them would have, which is that in virtue of the right functional role, it would be conscious.
Right. Okay, so this in my mind connects then to the hard versus easy problem because
Uh-huh.
just by saying that consciousness would just happen, that's not really explaining how. That's just saying
No, it
you've
isn't.
built in what you want.
It isn't. It isn't. And then there are just two points of view. One says, well, that's what consciousness is that functional role. And of course, there's the eliminativism that you just mentioned. So, there are a number of different views. But yeah, I think what a lot of functionalists think is that consciousness just is that complex functional role. And that if machines can have it, they're conscious.
Okay. Okay, that's a natural segue into discussion of the Turing test. So it's my understanding that the Turing
Okay.
test is a fairly famous proposed way of evaluating whether a machine is. This is a good question. Does the Turing test aim to give us a clue about when a system or a machine is intelligent or when it's conscious? Because in my mind, those are not one to one terms. They don't mean the same thing.
No, no, no. Those are quite different. Look, it was originally proposed by Turing as a test of thinking.
Okay.
And you know, in the first. Okay, so I was part of the group that did the first real Turing test, the Loebner Prize, And we advertised for people who didn't know anything about computers, and we got some, but knew how to type. So we got some people, and we tried them out on this famous ELIZA program.
Mm.
It's a very simple. That program.
I've
It's very
heard of it.
simple. It, yeah, it's 100 lines in BASIC, the original version. You can find it online.
Okay.
And those people were fooled. They thought they were talking to a person. So the, I think in a perfectly reasonable sense, the Turing test was passed already by Weizenbaum's program. The Turing test is a silly thing. It's just, can you get a computer to fool a chatbot to fool people into thinking it's thinking? Okay, maybe you can, maybe you can't. So it's misled a lot of people, and it's been a bit of a uh, 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 you know uh, uh, it's been a distraction, really,
Okay, so what is the
fooling people into thinking your thinking isn't thinking.
right? Well, I agree. So then before getting to the issues, still, like, what is the Turing test? It's just the attempt.
It was originally proposed as a test of thought. Uh, uh, then there was a series of real Turing tests, the Loebner Prize, year after year. I was a judge in a number of them. I played a role in a number of them. And Loebner didn't want to give out the money,
Mm.
and it turned out the winning program for many years, maybe even up. I mean, it was abandoned maybe, I don't know, 10 years ago. And when Loebner died. But the winning program was always a version of the Weizenbaum ELIZA program, and one that was basically just a long list uh, uh, of you know responses to various queries, and very simple devices for changing a question. So my father, tell me. My father told me to come here. Tell me about your father. That kind of thing.
Mm.
Changing it around and some key words. It's If you look at my article, the mind is the software of the brain. I summarize it. It's on my website. You can see it. I summarize some of the Loebner stuff, and people, some people were fooled that very simple-minded chatbot, and other people weren't. What Loebner did was he got experts who would easily be able to unmask the chatbots. So because he didn't want to give away the money, and
Right.
that's kind of unfair. Instead of getting people off the street, he got these very people who could very quickly figure out a way to. Now, of course, the current chatbots we've got, they could do a really good job of passing it. But most people who are adept with this stuff would have a pretty good idea of how to amass them. I'll tell you a very simple thing that I saw in a lecture the other day, and I tried it recently on the latest OpenAI O3. I'll tell you a couple of things you can do.
Mm.
If so, one, it's very funny. They can't count. Um, and so if you type in 30 letters, that is the same letter 30 times, how many letters did I just type?
Mm.
They can get 30 right, but not 29.
Hmm.
They tend to prefer even numbers. And I just tried that repeatedly with O3, the latest version of the OpenAI, and it got those wrong. I would do 29. It would tell me it was 28.
I see. And that's
And
like a
I
very basic.
carefully, yeah, I very carefully prepared it in advance, so I knew how many letters there were.
Right.
Here, I'll tell you another one. They can't do basic arithmetic. They can do what to humans seem like very complex problem solving, but basic arithmetic. If you get it close to something that's on the web a lot, uh, they flub it. A few months ago, I tried various ways of doing four-digit multiplication.
Mm.
Uh, the original GPT-3, that was the last one where we had a really detailed summary of what it could do and It couldn't do. It couldn't do 3-digit multiplication. Um, so I tried various ways of it, and I found a number of mistakes in 4-digit multiplication. But of course, you have to disguise it. If you just give it the problem in a very raw form, it and maybe it calls a calculator or something. You have to make it difficult for it to know it is a multiplication problem.
In order for
Um,
it to solve
so,
it, you have to make it difficult for the.
what? What? I couldn't hear that. What?
Oh, sorry. I said so. In order to get ChatGPT to execute a 4-digit multiplication problem, you have to kind of obscure the details of the problem.
No, in order to get it to make a mistake.
I see. I see. Okay. Okay. So it's got to be very straightforward,
uh,
and then it can.
Here's one I heard in a lecture a couple of weeks ago by Tom Griffiths, who's doing a lot of AI work. He he said he in the lecture he said, look, there's a simple arithmetic formula that's on the web, in many places. Um, uh, 5/9 of a number plus 32. And the reason that's on the web is because it's the conversion of centigrade to Fahrenheit. So he said, look, if you do something very similar, like 4/9 plus 29, it gets the wrong answer. Because it's mesmerized by this thing that's in, the similarity stuff that's in it, similarities to things in its training data.
Right.
And I tried that at the time. O3 is a lot better than some of the models he was using. So some of the things. Here's another one. So this is was in an article in Science by Melanie Mitchell. Uh, um, Julia has 2 sisters and a brother. How many sisters does the brother have?
2 sisters.
And the answer is 3 sisters, because
Oh, shoot.
Julia has 2 sisters.
See,
That's a mistake.
we're editing this
That's
part
a
out.
mistake.
So, no, I'm just kidding.
Oh no, don't edit it. So that's a mistake that a bunch of different models made. I recently tried that on O3 and it doesn't make that mistake.
Okay.
So, but you never know what's happened. Did they made it more sophisticated, or did they just read the article in
Yeah.
Science and make sure it didn't make that mistake anymore? So you don't know. But look, they're getting better and better. But it can't, as Gary Marcus pointed out years ago, they have no facility with rule-based reasoning. They are they are simulating rule-based reasoning with pattern matching. And there's a big difference between rule-based reasoning and pattern matching. And that's why a lot of people feel that for intelligence, you need a hybrid model. You need to combine the pattern completion kind of AI that we have now in these LLMs with something that really does an old-fashioned computer program that does rules and representations.
So what is that's a good question. That leads to a good question. What's the difference between rules-based reasoning and similarity reasoning, or whatever you call it? Like, what does that mean?
The rules-based reasoning is you have the rules of arithmetic and you have quantification over variables. You know that for all x, blah, 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 and then you can substitute a value in. That's not, they don't do that. Or at least the basic mechanism of it is, of the LLMs, is not to do that. Now, some people think that in order to do the pattern completion, they have to, in effect, construct rule-based reasoning. But there's no strong case that they actually can do that. So, yeah.
Yeah, one illustration that might bring that distinction home is one that Alex O'Connor did a video on, about how if you ask ChatGPT to produce an image of a full glass of wine, it can't do it. It will only ever give you about half a glass of wine, because the overwhelming majority of photos of glasses of wine on the internet is of half full glasses. And that suggests similarity based reasoning without the underlying fundamental principle of like how you would go to a full
Yeah,
glass.
yeah.
So that
Yeah, that is a common kind of problem that they're not thinking it through from scratch. They're just using what's in effect what's compressed in their memory. A similar one to that I tried just a few days ago. That's worked for years, but there is a new image model coming out from OpenAI that may be better. Um, and that so if you say draw a picture. Show me a picture, a realistic, photorealist picture of a fancy display case in a jewelry store uh, with 11 vintage watches, with all showing expensive vintage watches, all showing 315, and what you get is 10 after 10. And the reason for that is expensive watches on the internet are all they like this kind of spread of hands,
mm,
and in 315 the little hand and the big hand are pointing in the same direction, or you can do 6:30 or midnight or something like that, and they and you can see that they're just not doing they're not they're they're not doing something that looks it looks less like reasoning than it does like pattern completion, where the patterns are based on patterns in their memory,
mm.
which is of course what they are. That's what they do.
Right. Right. Okay, so shifting gears backwards for a second, I wanted to ask you with respect to the Turing test. So the Turing test, I take it, is just essentially the claim that if you can no longer tell as a human being that you're not interacting with a human being, then whether the metric is consciousness or thinking or intelligence, then you should infer that the thing you're interacting with has intelligence or thinking or
Well,
consciousness.
okay, so there's a big difference between you should infer,
Mm,
which may be defeasible, and something stronger like it follows that.
right. Okay.
So the Turing test view, the view that Turing himself had, was behaviorism. He was looking for a
Mm,
conceptually sufficient condition,
I
and
see.
he was mesmerized by his own success in creating a notion of mechanical computation that could be so that you could use Turing computable, that you could use to avoid the intuitive notion of mechanical computability. Computability by a Turing machine was a substitute, a conceptual substitute for mechanical computability, and he wanted to do the same thing for thought. Substitute something scientific for the vague ordinary notion of thinking. And so he thought, I mean, interpolating, his position was that you could get something that would be conceptually sufficient for thinking,
Right. Okay.
because he thought that the right behavior was conceptually sufficient for thinking, and of course, all you need to show that that's false is a conceptual example of a complete brute force problem solver, and I produced such an example long ago, and it's been called the Blockhead, and it's basically just a brute force system that gives the right answers to all the good, reasonable answers to all questions up to a certain length.
Mm. And then the idea is that so what are the details of Blockhead? Why should we infer that this entity isn't thinking?
Yeah, so a, a good way to think about it is in terms of tic tac toe.
Mm,
So you can write a complete tree for tic tac toe. So, you let the opponent go first. There are 9 possible moves. And then all the programmers have to do is put in one move for each of those 9. And then there are 7 moves left. So sprouting under the tree are will be under each of those moves that the machine makes will be 7, and then then you have to the programmers can put in a reasonable response to each of those. So you have a complete tree that, if you follow it through properly, will always give you at least a draw. Well, the idea of the blockhead is like that, except for responses in a Turing test.
Okay.
You start with any string of letters that a judge could type in under a certain length of time, and then the programmers have to put in a response to each one. And again, you have a tree structure. I mean, it's enormous,
Right.
astronomically enormous. So it's not really possible, as Stuart Cheever showed in an article in a philosophy journal. But it's a conceptual example of how you could have something that responded as well as a person in any test under a certain length of time,
Okay.
without it being an intelligent being or being a conscious being, for that matter.
Okay. Well, that makes sense to me. And with respect to Blockhead specifically, so the Turing test seems to connect to functionalism. It seems that just as the behaviorist would be far more open to the Turing test as a legitimate, sufficient condition for intelligence or consciousness, is that the same case? Is the case the same for the functionalist? They would say that some form of the Turing test is right because you can execute, because ChatGPT could eventually execute functions perfectly, so that we could no longer tell the difference.
No, the Turing test is a behaviorist conception.
Mm,
Functionalists are not behaviorists. They think what's going on inside is important.
mm.
They're not going to be troubled by a brute force machine, because they'll, if they're reasonable, they'll say, "Yeah, I agree. That's not thinking. That's just brute force."
Okay. So really,
So functionalists are not behaviorists.
right. So really, nobody these days seems to regard the Turing test as a legitimate test, or are there still schools within philosophy and cognitive science who hold out hope for it?
I don't know any good philosopher who's advocated the Turing test, but I could be wrong.
Okay.
Uh, Behaviorism is really not a popular view anymore. Functionalism is just so much better.
Right. Right. So the last piece of machinery I wanted to put in place before a few more questions about artificial intelligence is the distinction you've drawn between phenomenal consciousness and access consciousness. What's that?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So this is really very much in the same ballpark. Phenomenal consciousness is the subjectivity of which you spoke earlier, and access consciousness is an informational notion based on global availability of information. So the idea then is that you could, I mean, the dualist argument is you could have all that global. Sorry, uh, uh, the the argument against functionalism is that you could have all that global availability without any phenomenology, without any subjectivity. So it's a way of crystallizing these two very different intuitions. And interestingly, I wrote a paper. I wrote a number of papers on this in the 1990s, and I got different reviews. I got opposite reviews from two different reviewers, and I never did
Happens all
find
the
out who
time.
they were. But somebody said, one of the reviewers said, "Oh, it was accepted," but one reviewer said, "Well, I see why you use the word consciousness for the subjectivity. That's really what consciousness is. But why do you use the word consciousness for this global availability of information?" And then another reviewer said the opposite. "I see why you use the word consciousness for the global availability, but these little twinges, what does that matter?"
So what is global availability of information? I mean, that's ambiguous to me. What does that mean with respect to consciousness?
I think a good way to think about it actually is in terms of the global workspace model, which wasn't when I first introduced all this stuff. That wasn't available, or at least it wasn't available in a form in which it. But it's global broadcasting. It's the idea that what it is for perception to be access conscious is for it to be made available to systems of cognitive systems of reporting, reasoning, um, decision making, action, reporting. Oh, I said reporting. Yeah, the things like
Okay.
that.
Okay. And then, so you've made the point though that phenomenal consciousness can outstrip access consciousness. What is that?
Yeah,
What is that?
not everybody agree. Not everybody agrees with that, but yeah, I think that you have a very rich tapestry of experience, but we know that there's a cognitive bottleneck
Hmm.
that you can only put about four items, where item is an interesting disputed concept itself, into working memory. And so the others all disappear. And the experiment that inspired me was this experiment by George Sperling, where he, in one form, flashed 3 rows of 4 letters on a screen for a period between 50 and 500 milliseconds. And then it was off, and subjects had to say what letters they saw, and they could report roughly 4 letters, even though they said they saw them all, especially if it was 500 milliseconds. Um, and he thought, well, hey, look, I'll test to see whether they did really see them all by having a test where they get a cue after the signal has gone off. They can either get a high note for the top row, a middle note for the middle row, or a low note for the bottom row. And what he found was, with that cue, after the signal had gone off, they could report 3 or 4 from any given row. So that suggested that they really did
Hmm.
have a phenomenal icon, he called it, or it was called, that had all or almost all the letters represented in it.
I
So
see.
my thought was that consciousness, the conscious appreciation of all or almost all those letters, overflows how many you can cognitively process.
Right.
And a lot of people are persuaded by that. It's funny, but a lot of people aren't. But when I first introduced it, nobody was persuaded by it. But it's funny, as time has gone on, so many people now say it's obviously true. It's the
Yeah.
So I think something to do with the legitimacy of phenomenal consciousness has made it seem obvious to many people who, even though it didn't seem so originally in the '90s.
Now, does the overflow argument and this just this general claim that the phenomenal can outstrip the access, do you take that to have implications for one's view in the philosophy of mind? I mean, does this
Oh yeah,
cause trouble for
absolutely. It
functionalism? Does
shows
it?
it shows that cognition and consciousness are two different things.
Okay.
They have different capacities. That's that is a huge difference, and shows they're different. So yeah, it does have. I mean, that's what I think anyway. But that has big consequences for the nature of the mind.
Mm. Okay. So in the last 15 minutes, I I'd be remiss if I didn't ask more about AI, since that's all anyone talks about these days. What at the most general level is artificial intelligence? Because I think there's a certain ambiguity surrounding what AI is when certain people talk about the dangers of AI. Someone like Neil deGrasse Tyson will say, "Look, we've had AI since we've had calculators." So what is artificial intelligence?
Look, I don't think there's any good general definition. It's machine intelligence. Um, uh, though, of course, the machines that have captivated everybody are these large language models
Mhm.
that work via There are neural networks that work by pattern completion, but there were before the neural networks. In the 60s, there was a competition basically between what's now thought of as old-fashioned symbolic AI and neural network approaches. And Minsky and Papert wrote this book called Perceptrons that argued that there were basic computations that the neural networks could not do. But of course, they didn't consider all the hidden layers. They just had two layers. But that did kill neural network research for a long while. But now everybody realizes, and nobody predicted just how good it is. I mean, it's pretty amazing. I was in an AI discussion group for a number of years, and we realized in 2021 that this was a major big thing. With GPT-3, it could do amazing things, and it had amazing problems. Uh, uh, Unfortunately, I couldn't figure out any way to profit from it
Right.
because I knew it was going to be. I knew it was going to be big, but I didn't see. I didn't realize that the thing to do would be to buy Nvidia stock.
Yeah, that would have been good.
And then in 2022, when it was released, my God, people went nuts over it. So these models are getting better and better. They're incredibly expensive, but look, they still have the same basic flaws that the original models have, which is that they are just fancy versions of pattern completion. They can't do rule-based reasoning, and it is intrinsic to the way they work that they will make stuff up. Sometimes people call that confabulation
Mm.
because they are just pattern completing, and there are truth-seeking ways of pattern completing and fictions seeking ways of pattern completion, and there's just always going to be a mix of those. The AI companies are doing their best to stamp out the confabulation, but it's intrinsic to the operation of them. You never want those things to be in charge of anything. And the problem we're having is that we now have agent models that will leak out into the world and be doing things, and that is a very dangerous thing.
Why is confabulation intrinsic to the nature of LLMs? What's the connection?
Because they're just pattern completing. They're pattern completing, and they don't intrinsically know the difference between a completion of a pattern that is that represents reality and one that
Mm,
doesn't.
I
At
see.
least that is on the face of it, the case. So they do this reinforcement. So our modern LLMs are pattern completers with a number of fixes introduced by a reinforcement training, where they try to stamp out. They have actual people saying, no, that's not a good answer. And they are trying to stamp out the some people call it hallucination, some
Sure.
people call it confabulation. But that, it's just intrinsic to the operation that it's going to be happening. You can't stamp it all out.
So I had a question here that says, could a large language model ever be conscious, or is it just not the right sort of thing to produce consciousness? But I gather that you would say that a pattern completing system, a large language model like that, could not be.
I think the more sensible issue is, can it think? Could one of these things think?
Okay.
And so I would argue that uh, without rule-based reasoning, they will be very, very unlikely to do anything that deserves to be called thought. But I think I'm a believer in the physical substrate. I'm writing a paper now called "Can Is it the case that only a meat machine can be conscious?"
Hmm.
So I think there's some case for the idea that you need a meat realization to be conscious. So
Hmm.
I'm very doubtful that these that these LLMs could be conscious.
Now, why is that? What's special about the physical substratum of meat versus other physical entities?
We don't know, of course, because we don't understand what consciousness is in scientific terms. But what I argue in this paper is that the examples we have of conscious beings, they have both functional role and meat realizations, and we simply don't know whether to extrapolate from the functional role or from the meat realizations.
Hmm.
So at least that's my case.
Okay. Well, one distinction often drawn in this conversation is between narrow and general artificial intelligence, where I take it that
Mhm.
a narrow AI is an AI system capable of surpassing human intelligence with respect to a very narrowly defined task, and a general AI is
For
something that
sure.
can surpass
Yeah.
human ability across the board. Um, what?
Yeah. So, of course, the old symbolic systems could greatly surpass humans in mathematics,
Hmm.
in complicated problem solving, complicated math, complicated calculation. So we already have, before the rise of the neural networks, we already had very good narrow AI in certain areas.
So, where do LLMs fall on this spectrum? I imagine between narrow and general AI. Certainly, they seem closer to general artificial intelligence than a calculator. They can do a whole range of tasks, not everything, but much more so than I guess previous kinds of AI. Is that right?
Oh yeah, absolutely. Yeah, no, there's some applications for which they're terrific. Medical diagnosis, for example. So yeah, I think what you said is right. There's somewhere in between narrow and broad AI.
What is your opinion about? Well, let me rephrase. Do you think we're on the verge of general AI?
No, because there is a basic conceptual issue that we have not solved, which is how to combine this pattern completion with rules and representations.
Mm.
Um, that's the unsolved problem. People are trying to make money off of hybrid systems, but nobody has really cracked the problem of how to integrate those two kinds of systems. But
Okay.
until we can do that, we won't have something that machines that are really intelligent, in my view.
Would you are you willing to go on the books and say, do you think that we will probably one day crack the code, or are you just agnostic?
I think there are ideas missing. I
Hmm.
think that uh, it's an often made mistake to fail to realize that when there's a scientific breakthrough, new ideas are produced. So it's something that people have often pointed out about these LLMs, but I'm going to mention it anyway because it is a really important fact. There has been no breakthrough in neural networks, including LLMs, for 40 years. So the basic principle of operation of LLMs is what was introduced in the 80s. It's back propagation. Back propagation of error is the basic way. Is the basic
Hmm.
idea. There have been small improvements, so-called attention heads, convolutional neural networks, which transformers are not. Uh, but these things are really tweaks. The basic operation of, and I'm not the only one who says that. My colleague Jan LeCun, who's the chief of AI for Facebook, says the same thing. And he includes his own production of convolutional neural nets. There has been no breakthrough. The reason they are doing so well is um, tons of compute
Hmm.
and enormous databases. That has been the engine of success. And in terms of you know basic changes in our understanding, it hasn't happened.
Hmm. Okay. Well, ending on a more philosophical note, in the broadest sense, as you think about the progress of AI over time, would it bother you? Would it worry you if we did happen upon artificial general intelligence? Would that
No, no. It, it might be the end of the human race. If they if they get control of things and they don't like us. uh,
okay?
but I'd be sad if all conscious creatures disappeared. Uh, so it's, I think, a bit of an unknown future. We don't know what their values would be. We don't know what they would want to do. So, I mean, that is one thing about current AI is it doesn't want anything except except predicting the next word.
Hmm. Okay. Okay.
No
Well,
plans, no wants.
right. Well, okay. So you would be worried. I take it. Those are pretty bad outcomes, possibilities.
Yeah, of course. Yeah, yeah,
Okay. Okay. Well, I mean that's all my questions, Ned. Thank you so much for coming on the podcast.
yeah. No,
This was fun.
yeah. Nice talking to you. Uh, and let me know when it's ready. I mean, I'll even watch it.